If you live pretty much anywhere that's not on the equator, chances are you've noticed that just how long the sun is in the sky varies quite dramatically during the year. During the winter, the sun often sets before people get off of school or work, and during the summer, it's hard to find a point where it isn't daytime. But what if I told you there are places near the poles where this phenomenon is taken to the extreme, with constant sunlight and total darkness for weeks or even months on end? This is what's known as the midnight sun. Now, before we get into never-ending daylight, I'd appreciate you would like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. So, how exactly does the midnight sun happen? Well, it all boils down to the same idea as why seasons exist in the first place. You see, Earth's axis is not perfectly perpendicular to the ecliptic plane, or in other words, the plane that the solar system is on. Instead, Earth is tilted at about 23.5 degrees in relation to the plane. The reason why this happened is because not long after Earth first formed, an object the size of Mars, known as Theia, collided with Earth, an impact so massive that it tilted the entire planet. Fun fact, this collision also ejected an incredible amount of debris from both objects, which ended up in Earth's orbit and coalesced to become the Moon. The tilt itself is significant because it's not constantly pointing towards or away from the Sun. Rather, the orientation in relation to the Sun varies depending on where Earth is in its orbit. At some parts of the year, the Earth's northern hemisphere is pointed towards the Sun, and at other parts of the year, it's pointed away. But here's the most important bit. While the Earth itself is tilted, the border between daytime and nighttime, known as the terminator line, is not. As a result, when the Earth is tilted towards or away from the Sun, you may experience more or less time on the daylit side of Earth, depending on which hemisphere you're in. In other words, you experience daytime or nighttime for longer. This phenomenon gets more and more extreme the further away from the equator you get, and it all comes to a head at a special latitude that's approximately 66.5 degrees north or south of the equator. At this line, there will be at least one day in the year, usually on the summer or winter solstices, where you never cross the terminator line at all. Essentially, the sun never rises or sets. The phenomenon where the sun never sets is aptly named the midnight sun, as the sun is out even at what's supposed to be the deepest and darkest time of the night. And the inverse is known as polar night, since something like moon noon isn't nearly as catchy. The closer to the poles you get, the longer both phases happen, until at the poles themselves you have a situation where the sun is up for 6 months in the summer and down for 6 months in the winter, creating a day that is an entire year long. Okay, so now that we got all the crazy technical stuff out of the way, what places generally see midnight sun and polar night happen? Well, in the northern hemisphere, quite a lot of places. Europe, in particular, has a lot of people who live north of the Arctic Circle, owing to a far milder climate than other places this far north, with several major cities in Iceland, Norway, and Russia that see weeks or even months of midnight sun. The largest of these cities, Murmansk in Russia, houses about 300,000 people despite being hundreds of miles north of the Arctic Circle. Outside of Europe, the Arctic is far more sparsely populated owing to a significantly harsher climate and general remoteness from everything else. Alaska only has a few thousand people north of the Arctic Circle, most of which are in one small town at the northernmost point of the state. Canada has even fewer people, with the already comically low populations of their northern territories moving almost exclusively south of the Arctic Circle. But what about the southern hemisphere? Well, as if the Canadian tundra wasn't lonely enough, very few people at all see the midnight sun from a southern hemisphere perspective. This is because pretty much the entirety of the land in this area is Antarctica, which is home to a handful of research stations and not a whole lot else. The southernmost major city in the southern hemisphere is Ushuaia, Argentina, a city that is about 10 degrees to the north of the Antarctic Circle. Now, let's look at the elephant in the room. If the sun is up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, why aren't the poles the hottest places on the planet? After all, long days during the summer are exactly what makes summer so warm to begin with, since the sun is able to continuously heat the surface for longer. Well, it all has to do with how direct the sunlight is. At the equator, where the days rarely exceed 12 hours in length, the fact that the sun is directly overhead means that the sunlight hitting the surface is much more direct, which heats the surface much more efficiently. On the other hand, the 24-hour sunlight that polar regions experience in the summer doesn't have the sun climb nearly as high in the sky, which makes heating the surface much less efficient since the sun rays are more spread out. It makes sense if you think about it, since generally, sunlight in mid afternoon, when the sun is high in the sky, feels a lot warmer and is more likely to sunburn you than sunlight immediately after sunrise or before sunset. That's not to say that the Arctic region can't get hot at all, however. Interior regions as Siberia and northern Canada can reach temperatures that rival warm summer days in more southerly latitudes, and these high temperatures combined with the months long day can and do cause extreme wildfires to develop. On a similar vein, while the sun doesn't climb particularly high during the midnight sun, it also doesn't go very far below the horizon during the polar night. As a result, while there are lengthy periods where the sun never breaches the horizon, most places will see some twilight even around the winter solstice, and some places getting bright enough to read without artificial light for a few hours. However, the lack of real sunlight for weeks or even months on end can and does have a mental and physical toll on people who live in these regions. In particular, a phenomenon called seasonal affective disorder, or appropriately SAD for short, is particularly intense in areas with polar night due to how little sunlight there is for so long. On a more positive note, however, many Arctic cities and towns have festivals to commemorate the arrival of the polar night and midnight sun, which really goes to show the huge influence that polar night and midnight sun have on culture as a whole. In addition, midnight sun is one of the major tourist draws in places like Alaska and Iceland, if for no other reason that it is simply surreal to see the sun out at a time of day where you're usually looking at the Milky Way. And on that note, that's all I had to say about the midnight sun. As always, I'd appreciate you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Thanks and have a great day.